Action, excitement,
horror, romance,
thrills and chills,
swords and sorcery,
rockets and ray guns, a dizzying panoply of the strange and impossible from the darkest depths of the human imagination. What mad universe encompasses such tales as these? Join us as we bear witness to the sweeping sprawl of all the history that never was and all the futures that could yet be. It's adventure as you like it on What Mad Universe?
There be islands in the central sea, whose waters are bounded by no shore, and where no ships come. This is the faith of their people. Before there stood gods upon Olympus, or ever Allah was Allah, had wrought and rested Mana Yud Sushai. There are in Pegāna Mung, and Sish, and Kib, and the maker of all small gods, who is Mana Yud Sushai. Moreover, we have a faith in Rune and Slid. And it has been said of old that all things that have been were wrought by the small gods, excepting only Mana Yud Sushai, who made the gods, and hath thereafter rested. And none may pray to Mana Yud Sushai, but only the gods whom he hath made. But at the last will Mana Yud Sushai forget to rest, and will make again new gods, and other worlds, and will destroy the gods whom he hath made. And the gods and the worlds shall depart, and there shall be only Mana Yud Sushai. Hi, I'm Adam Prosser. With me is Phil Price.
Hello.
Doing, as always, it's What Mad Universe, the podcast about pulp and the history of sci-fi and fantasy. We're talking about a book, actually a couple of books, but the first one was published in 1905 by Edward John Morton Drax Plunkett, the 18th Baron Dunsany.
Also known as Lord Dunsany.
Also Lord Dunsany.
Which we'll be referring to him as, because the other name is both long and ridiculous.
And that is how he was always credited, was Lord Dunsany, so fair enough. So he was the scion of a noble Irish family that traced its lineage back to the 12th century. Dunsany had an otherwise undistinguished life to that point. He'd served in the Second Boer War, stood for Parliament as a Conservative, he lost obviously, and had met Rudyard Kipling and William Butler Yeats, but had shown surprisingly little interest in literature, having only written some unremarkable poetry. However, the self-published book, The Gods of Pegāna, attracted critical attention and was a financial success. A series of fables written in archaic language and purporting to be the scripture of a pagan religion of a lost kingdom. It was followed by another volume, Time and the Gods, in a similar vein and sharing the same setting. These two books and a few later stories became a bedrock of the modern fantasy genre, helping to establish the idea of what Tolkien called sub-created worlds and shared mythoses, inspiring other writers from H.P. Lovecraft to Neil Gaiman. In many ways, Dunsany is the godfather of the 20th century fantasy genre. So he's kind of whenever we talk about this, I always feel like, we haven't read everything that's out there in the entire world. So sometimes, you want to be careful to make bold pronouncements about this is the first, this is the pivotal, whatever. But he really seems like he was one of the pivotal figures of modern fantasy.
Yeah, he's basically your favorite fantasy author's favorite fantasy author.
Right, exactly. That's a very good way to put it, yes. He was, not the first to sort of create a fantasy world and really bring it to life, but he really took it to the next level. I can't even think of an example before that where they really said, we're going to create a world and the details of, in this case, the religion is kind of the focus. Yeah,
well, I mean, William Morris to a degree, but those aren't that interesting.
Yeah. I mean, usually, I would say, again, he's not necessarily the first to do this, I mean, but usually when somebody's creating another, quote, world, it would be something like, it would be arabesque fantasy, like the Arabian Nights, and they'd create they'd do something like the much later Princess Bride did, where they created the fictional kingdoms of Florin and Gilder, but it's still supposed to be our world, right? It's not supposed to be, set in another time in another place. And this is actually sort of supposed to be our world. He's a little vague about exactly what it is.
Yeah, he mentions the North Star and things like that, but it feels like these are the creation stories and the important myths of a culture that never existed.
Right, exactly.
And it feels very authentic in the sense that it feels like these are myths that a culture would come up with. But also not any that it also doesn't resemble any that actually exist.
Right.
So it's really interesting that way.
Yeah.
And it does have, you said arabesque. It does have a lot of Arabian and African influences in the style, while at the same time being its own thing.
Right.
And Dunsany was obviously interested in the Orientalism of the time and all that, which he later moved away from. There's a lot of these settings are sort of exotic and
right. Yeah, in the late 19th, early 20th century, if you really wanted to create an exotic, fantastic world, it was sort of descended from the Arabian Nights. That was kind of and occasionally Chinese or Eastern Asian culture. But that was sort of the go-to for, here's another kingdom. And people didn't, maybe, even though it was the 20th century by then, people didn't fully know every kingdom and every continent in the world necessarily, so they could sort of imagine there was a fictional kingdom. Although, to be fair, people into the 20th century, people were still making up fictional European kingdoms too. So it's not complete, you're just supposed to suspend disbelief, basically.
This never felt like cultural appropriation in the sense that some of these, that it could have been, I suppose.
Right.
It does feel like there's elements taken from ideas, like European ideas about what Arabia's like, and at the same time being its own world.
Right. Yeah, I mean, by that time there had been a few writers like H. Rider Haggard and Francis Burton who had literally lived in the Middle East or Africa or all these places, and they knew, and Rudyard Kipling who lived in India and all that stuff. And I mean, they were still coming from the sort of imperialist Western attitude of everything, but they knew quite a fair amount about the culture that was there, so they could write at least somewhat convincingly about it. In Pegāna, it's interesting because Pegāna kind of shifts a little about what it's supposed to be. As you say, there's definitely parts he talks about the city where the caravans end and the camels.
Yeah,
and so forth.
There's a lot of camels. There's a lot of scimitars and sort of just it evokes a certain period without actually recreating it in any way. Right,
but then there's other parts where it actually seems. I would almost say South Asian. Like he almost describes it as being Pegāna as being islands, if I'm not mistaken. Right?
Well, Pegāna itself is like heaven. I that's how I took it.
Yeah,
and the people live on Earth, and that's sort of outside of.
Right.
But Pegāna is also it is accessible by ship. So I don't know.
Yeah, he seems to shift a little bit, and even between the two books, I almost feel like he changed his idea, and he says something about these are the lands of my dreams or something. So
and that's common in later Dunsany as well. So we'll get to that later. But
no, it's so. I mean, he blurs whether it's supposed to be. Oh yeah, there's this kingdom off that very few people visit, and it's like this, blah blah blah, which is a standard jumping off point for fantasy. But then he actually goes to the extent of saying this is almost a hazy other realm, which is as you say, that's something he goes into with some of his other books as well.
Something I noticed on the reread for this podcast, because I read this years ago, but it mentions Africa early on, because there was a famine or a pestilence that came out of Africa. That's the only sort of real world geographical reference in this particular. Dunsany later mixed real world locations in his fantasy world all the time, but this is the only one in these collections. Yeah,
well, as you say, later on, was that in the first book or the second book that he
First book, I believe.
Oh, okay.
He mentions a pestilence out of Africa.
Oh, okay. All right. So yeah, no, you get as I say, you get the impression it's supposed to be a world reachable from our world, and but then it's almost a dream. There's a number of different techniques fantasy writers have used, especially around that period, to say this is why it's not quite our world. And
Dunsany doesn't really do that. He just he lets you fill in the blanks, I guess.
Right.
And he especially does that later, where you can take a train from London to the edge of the world. Sort of mixing even modern, Western countries with weird fantasy things that couldn't exist in the modern world.
Is that in Beyond the Fields We Know, or is that somewhere?
That's in. That was in. Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah.
But it was from the collection, The Book of Wonder, I believe.
Right. Yeah, The Book of Wonder. That's not technically a Pegāna.
No, it's not Pegāna at all.
Yeah.
No.
So he definitely liked that sort of whimsical, just pretend this isn't real. And I mean, it's as we've seen in the 19th century, and the stories tended to be kids' stories, but he's writing for adults. But
these aren't really kid appropriate.
Right. Yeah. I mean, they're actually, they're pretty dark in some ways.
Yeah.
And yet they have the sort of whimsical and just go with it and use your imagination feeling, which you're more likely to get in a kid's story. Where with an adult story, as I say, there's going to be some rationalization to let us suspend disbelief.
Yeah.
This is just like, I mean, it always derived from sort of ancient fantasy writings where it was kind of like, oh yeah, well, there's, we know the kingdom next door and the kingdom 2 kingdoms over, and then beyond that, who knows? And you can start writing about it. You can do the, what's his name? The guy who wrote the Herodotus, where he just starts making up stuff once he gets beyond the part he knows.
Africa is an island with dog-headed people.
Right, yeah. The farther you get from ancient Greece, the crazier the stories get for everything is. And that became...
the guys who have no head, but their face is on their chest.
Right.
I forget what they were called, but yeah.
Yeah, and the source of the Nile is a giant overflowing cup somewhere deep in Africa.
People actually literally believe these things because it was written by people who... Yeah.
I do kind of wonder, because Herodotus has always been criticized for being, literally, of course in the modern era, but there was a sense of, I think even at the time, people might have, they believed him because he spoke authoritatively, but that's all. He was just making stuff, or maybe he was repeating stories he'd heard.
Yeah, the dog-headed people, I know people literally believed in that till quite late, till the medieval period. So.
Right. Yeah, like Herodotus, along with Aristotle and a few others, was one of the great sort of bedrocks of when the Renaissance took off in the medieval. Like, that was one of the learned, knowledgeable people you would turn to learn about the world. And Herodotus was definitely one of them. So it gets vague on whether how much of it was. I think Herodotus was writing seriously. I don't know. I haven't made a study of Herodotus. I shouldn't speak with any kind of authority here. But I mean. That's where the fantasy starts to come in. It's the gaps of knowledge of what people know. And even as late as the 20th century, you can sort of stretch that into the average person might believe there was some African kingdom and I can just make up a story. Even though the writer is not presenting it as official, and this is what's actually the case. It's clearly a fantasy, but your mind can fall into that slot of, a magical kingdom somewhere. And then, of course, the other thing, as we've discussed in other shows, was, the sort of prehistorical kingdoms.
It could be like this is before history, and history has just forgot about all this.
Exactly, yeah, right. I mean, he does start, literally the opening of the first book is what I read at the beginning. There be islands in the central sea, whose waters are bounded by no shore and where no ships come. This is the faith of their people. But, and that's a present day statement, but you could kind of do the Star Wars thing with that, where he says, as I've said before, in Star Wars they say a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, but the people saying that, if you read what George Lucas intended, they were supposed to be people writing that, way in the future.
Oh, okay.
So Star Wars could still technically be in our future, but everyone interprets it as the past, basically, because of the way it's saying. So something similar is happening there with what Lord Dunsany potentially did. You could say it was an ancient land as well. But it's deliberately, more than any other writer of that period, or even many other periods that I can think of, just very blurry on whether.
Yeah, and I think that's part of its charm, part of what makes it interesting, because it's just very. evocative.
Right.
And I think that's a word that describes most of Dunsany's work, evocative, because he often, especially later on, really doesn't care about plots.
Right. Yes, that's something about Dunsany I've noticed. He writes, especially as you say, the later stuff. He'll tend to describe. He'll almost leave the plot off stage completely. And just describe the situation,
the setting, the mood. Mm-hmm. It's all about sort of the feeling that it gives you.
Right. Exactly. And there'll be ideas and things, but everything's kind of a snapshot.
Yeah.
And his stories tend to be fairly short. But it's a snapshot.
He has one collection called 51 Tales. It's literally 51 really short stories. Mm-hmm. And there's one that's only like a paragraph long, and it's just a joke.
Right, yeah. And I mean, in this Pegāna book, I mean, it was, as I said, it was self-published. It must have practically been a pamphlet, because it's something like, even with larger text and full paragraphs, it's something like 70 pages.
The first one is especially short.
Yeah. And so as we were saying, it was actually he was a wealthy gadabout type of person, and and it was even a number of people, even in the intro to the book, they kind of mention it's like he seemed like he was headed for a Bertie Wooster kind of idle life as a nobleman's son or whatever, and then suddenly out of the blue he produced this book which he paid to have published by himself. I forget the name of the guy, but it was a guy who's known as a poet, and he didn't usually do this, but apparently he liked it enough that he said, okay, I'll act as editor and I'll connect you with some publishers, which even a lord needs a connection in the publishing industry. And so then he got this published. And he was friends with Yeats. He knew Rudyard Kipling. There were a few other artists and poets of the Irish literary scene that he was cozy with at that time, basically. So he definitely had an in, basically. But it's been commented that he had, a couple of bad poems basically under his belt, and then suddenly out of nowhere he produced this story, which is kind of crazy.
Yeah, and he went on. He became extremely popular in his time,
right?
Which is weird because he's so forgotten now. I
don't know if that's necessarily true. He's forgotten
in pop culture,
right?
But at the time, he was part of pop culture. He was he did speaking tours and lecture tours. Lovecraft, by the way, was a big fan of this guy and was known to have visited one of his lectures at one point. Yeah, though he didn't speak to him.
Oh, okay. Well, it sounds like Lovecraft had trouble approaching anyone anyway.
Aleister Crowley, the occultist, was also a fan of Dunsany.
Oh, interesting.
He apparently wrote him after Dunsany's story, The Hashish Man, which is about a guy who smokes hashish and travels mentally to another land, sort of. Crowley wrote, "You obviously haven't smoked hashish," but he was a fan. He wrote a poem called "The Desert's Bastard Brother," which is about mixing a bunch of Lord Dunsany stories together.
Huh. Crowley did.
Yeah.
Huh, interesting. No, I know he was extremely popular at the time. With Dunsany, it's true. Yeah, you're right. Most people wouldn't necessarily know who he was. But if you talk to like a fantasist or a writer or someone, they will know Lord Dunsany or any kind of scholar. They'll absolutely know him because he is a huge... I mean, there was a period where H.P. Lovecraft wasn't that well known either.
Yeah,
like if
true.
you go back, 20, 30 years, he was kind of only nerds knew Lovecraft and they loved him, but the average person probably wouldn't have known who it was. And even to this day, there are probably a lot of people who don't know Lovecraft that well.
Yeah.
But they know the impact that he's made on pop culture. And it's the same way with Dunsany, I think.
Yeah, Dunsany hasn't had any movies made of his work, to my knowledge.
No.
And I don't think, like Lovecraft, I don't think they would translate very well. But it's at the same time sort of a shame that nobody's tried to...
Well, you say that, but there's been 5 or 6 Lovecraft attempts and plus a ton of movies that are basically Lovecraftian.
Yeah, most of them aren't very good, though.
Yeah.
There's I like The Reanimator, but that's really silly. From Beyond is the same thing. And Mouth of Madness is loosely inspired by him. And
anyway, we're getting off topic.
With
Lovecraft. We'll do a Lovecraft show someday. We'll find a way to do Lovecraft. It'll be interesting. But when you read Dunsany, the influence that he had on Lovecraft is enormous.
Yeah.
You cannot...
The dream cycle, Lovecraft's dream cycle, is straight up him trying to write in the style of Lord Dunsany.
Right.
I think one of the early stories that Lovecraft wrote was The Doom That Came to Sarnath, and it has a lot of Dunsany influence in it. It's basically a Pegāna story.
Right.
And it has I believe it was a gate made out of a single piece of ivory, which is from a Dunsany story. So
yeah,
which is a plot point in a later Dunsany story set in the Dreamlands.
Right, which is in the collection I have, that one is included as a Pegāna story. Actually.
Oh, okay.
Even though you can argue it's not a Pegāna story, but these
it's set in the Idle Days of the Yon.
Yeah, Idle Days on the Yon.
Okay, yeah.
And then the follow-up story to that one. And Beyond the Fields, we know this book that I have collects it with the other Pegāna stories.
Oh, okay.
But you can make a case...
Doesn't... Yeah, it's somebody from London traveling to the land of dreams, so
right.
It's not quite...
But then that does actually suggest... Because I do... Like I say, I believe he suggests that the Pegāna stories are... The culture that produced the Pegāna stories live in the dream world. So it's this argument over, okay, are these Pegāna... Just like, again, going with Lovecraft, there was an argument over what is their mythos, and they kind of assembled it after the fact. So even though there's explicitly...
Yeah, it's not world building in the sense of Tolkien.
No.
And Tolkien also read Dunsany, and actually wrote a letter criticizing one of his later stories.
You don't say.
Yeah, it was the distressing tale of Thorgobrin the Jeweler, which takes place mostly in what seems like a ancient fantasy world. But then at the end, one of the characters, it says she never died, and she called her home the English Riviera and lives there today and sews platitudes into doilies.
Okay.
And Tolkien just, it broke his suspension of disbelief, and he really criticized Dunsany for that one.
He had a real hang-up on, you have to keep, you can't ever bring in anything from the modern world into a fantasy world.
Yeah.
He gave C.S. Lewis a lot of crap for that, too, when he was writing the Narnia books.
Yeah, that seemed to be his thing. And also the Worm Ouroboros, which I'm sure we'll discuss one day.
I know you're a fan of that one,
Yeah, he criticized that one for the naming conventions.
Right. Yeah, Tolkien had a really, really specific idea of what you were, quote, allowed to do with fantasy.
He liked these things, but he still criticized them.
Right.
So.
Yeah, well, he criticized Shakespeare, for God's sake. Parts of Lord of the Rings are him literally going, I'll rewrite Shakespeare and it'll be better, basically.
Yeah.
Macbeth. Anyway. But, yeah, no, there's a very clear Lovecraft influence, or Tolkien's very clearly influenced by him as well.
And, but Lovecraft, I mean... As a thought, the blind idiot god who sits at the center of all things in Lovecraft, the idea of a god who will one day wake and destroy everything.
Right.
Like
let's explain it. It's Mana Yud Sushai is the creator of this world. He created the god. Actually, what he did was he created the other gods.
Yeah, and then he slept.
A guy called another god named Skarl started playing a drum, which lulled him to sleep. And then in his absence, the other gods were free to make the world. But someday Skarl the drummer is going to stop drumming. There's going to be silence, which somehow will wake up Mana Yud Sushai. He'll wake up and, depending on which of the two books you read, either he'll do away with the gods and worlds, or the other gods will sail off on a ship, and then he'll do away with the worlds.
Yeah.
And the Hound of Time will come and eat the gods.
Yeah.
He'll eat all the gods, and then end with Mung, the god of death,
fighting the god of time, and they kill each other.
Right. Exactly.
Not the god of time, but the
Hound of Time.
The Hound of Time.
Right. And then Skarl will just wander off somewhere, and Mana Yud Sushai will be free to make a new world, basically. Yeah. Which has a trace of Hindu or Buddhist aspect to it.
It's less horror based than Lovecraft's version, but the influence is clearly there. Like, it's very clear that where he got this idea from.
Yeah, that's funny. That's the thing. I wouldn't call these horror stories.
Oh, they're not at all.
But they have all those elements which you can see woven into Lovecraft's stories, like not just Lovecraft but other people. And there are some horrific stuff. There's one story of one of the there's a line of prophets that get described, and one of the prophets, when he's young and he's chosen to be a prophet because he doesn't fear Mung, i.e. death, and he curses Mung all day light, and they elevate him to prophet, and he sits in his youth and strength and curses Mung all day long, and everyone's in awe of him. And then as he starts to get older, he starts to say, he starts to feel his back is sore, and he's starting to go, oh, it'll be great when I'm dead, basically. So he starts to praise Mung, and Mung keeps going, shall a man curse a god? Shall a man curse a god? So he starts praising Mung more and more and more, and then they talk about how he's still there, and he's basically a pile of bones, and he's still praising Mung, trying to get Mung to take him away, his death, basically. And again, that's not framed as a horror story, but it's pretty horrific.
Yeah,
you know.
There's also there's another one where a prophet sees the gods beyond the gods of Pegāna. This is later when they're sort of moving away from the central pantheon. So this is four specific gods,
right?
And he sees two greater gods beyond them who are mocking them. So he goes and spends his time worshiping those other gods who are mocking. Then he sees another god, and basically this goes on until he's an old man and all his followers have left him, and he finds the gods behind that god, and it's the original gods that
right. And it's again
that he had forsaken to follow the other gods. So
right, and it's so there's a level of whimsy to it, but it's also you can see the cosmic horror that inspired Lovecraft coming out of that, basically,
and also the. Like you mentioned, like Tales from the Crypt, sort of ironic punishment sort of thing.
Yeah, a few people like that. There's also one about the Imbaun, who's kind of the most important prophet, the last of the line of prophets that get described.
Oh yeah,
he meets. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, he curses the gods themselves with by telling them about their death, and they're left questioning whether what he said was true.
Right. Yeah.
And so
but then there's also he meets the one god Zobokar, Zodrak, his name is, and he's a he appears to Imbaun and he says he was a shepherd back in ancient times, and the gods basically took him up to basically play with him and said, what would you like? And he said, well, I'd like man to be wealth. So they created gold and wealth, and all kinds of misery came out of that. And I'd like love, and they created love, but everyone got, jealousy and horrible. And I'd want man to create
wisdom.
And wisdom made man miserable and stuff like that. So he basically was begging Imbaun for forgiveness for giving all these things to mankind.
Yeah. And saying, I was a shepherd. I couldn't not know.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. So it was, again, there's the as you say, Tales from the Crypt kind of irony going on in that one. For much of the early 20th century, ironic twists were a big thing in short fiction, and you can see that's one of the Henry was the origin of that, I think, but you can see it in Dunsany as well. There's more than a trace of that.
Yeah.
But as you say, he's very atmospheric. Imbaun's also interesting because he portrays this world of very, like, it's a pretty bleak world in terms it's all about the religion of this world and about how the gods treat men, and the gods are just bastards. Like
they're more Greek god than modern sort of theological pleasant gods.
Yeah, they're not even honestly, I know, Greek gods are pretty, but Greek gods at least are just really like selfish and don't care what they do. These gods like go out of their way to like do nasty things to humans because they think it's funny.
Some of them do.
Some of them, yeah. No, as with most pantheons, there's some gods who are maybe nicer than other ones.
But even the gods are being played with by it has Fate and Chance are playing a game with the gods, like using the gods as pieces.
Right. Yes.
So that
there's the story about how it got started with Fate and Chance playing dice, and one of them, meaning the difference between was it all destined or was it random chance, basically, and one of them won and got to call the shots, but we're not going to find out which one it was until the end of the world, basically. Which there's much discussion of end of the world in this. They have an apocalypse. And again, you say that and it sounds really dramatic, but it's almost just kind of like, and then Manu shall wake up.
It's sort of a passing on rather than a going out with a bang sort of thing.
Right.
It's just time moving on.
Right.
Speaking of that, there's one story about a king who wants to conquer time because time is the enemy of all things, and takes away people, ages people, and so forth. So he travels into the kingdom of time and comes back aged.
Right, which that's a bit like the Greek story of I've forgotten his name, but there was the king who asked the gods for eternal life, but he didn't ask for eternal youth.
Yeah.
And so he just got older and older and older, and then he became a grasshopper, supposedly. So that's the origin of the grasshopper. But it's that kind of thing.
This also has some sort of that style of creation myths. Like there's a story of Slid, who came down from the heavens. He's the god of the ocean. And he came down from the heavens and brought the oceans with him to cover the earth. And there was a war between the earth and the oceans. And a mountain called Tintaggon, that was the greatest mountain, held at bay the literally the oceans from completely consuming the earth. And that really feels like this. They had a mountain called Tintaggon that's next to the sea, and they created a story around how it stopped the ocean. Like, it really feels like a real myth somebody would have come up with.
Yeah. He's definitely read. Dunsany had clearly read a lot of mythology and fables and folk tales, in a sense, without making it. I wouldn't say they always feel 100% like you're right. The origin of that feels that way. I would say Dunsany feels like. It feels kind of like you're reading the Victorian or Edwardian era recounting of myths that have been passed down for hundreds of years. Because there's a modern polish on it, in a sense. That
it is
you would
written
get.
in fairly archaic language. I mean, it sort of has a lot of repetition, a lot of these and thous, and obviously, and a lot of. I would not do this thing.
Right. Yeah. Well, there's a guy named Francis Burton who he discovered the source of the Nile River. He was a really interesting character in the 19th century, and he's one of the fundamental the big translators of the Arabian Nights. He's not the only one, but his translation of the Arabian Nights is one of the. It was extremely popular in the 19th century when he put this out, and that would have been a big influence, I think, on Dunsany.
Oh, yeah.
His version of the Arabian Nights, and it's got that Burtonian language to it. So in the sense that you're reading like the third or fourth iteration of it that's been handed down to the 19th century. And a 19th century person is trying to sound archaic as opposed to like the King James Bible. Yeah. You know what I mean? It's got that polish to it. Like this culture has been around for thousands of years, and they've polished their myths more and more and more over the years.
Yeah, there's a change over the course of the two collections, because the original sort of Pegāna's pantheon, which are consistent throughout the early stories, eventually give way to sort of other gods that men create and so on.
Yeah.
And it feels like there's a real gulf of time between these sections.
Yeah.
There's one story about a giant statue that, like the god is a giant statue gathered the world under him. And this man, in his town, there's a pestilence, so he goes to pray to the god, but he finds writing at his feet that says it was made by man.
Right.
So that's sort of...
Right, yeah, he kind of calls into question how... The mythology itself calls into question how authentic the mythology is, and whether you can ever understand the gods and know who they are and everything. Because the first book, The Gods of Pegāna, that's got a consistent, as you say, it's like consistent scriptures, and it's pretty short. So even though it's technically multiple stories, some of them are, as you say, like a paragraph long. They're very short, and they go together, and it's only a 70 book volume, so you could see it as one big story if you wanted. So it's internally consistent. So when the second book came out, apparently only a year later, Time in the Gods, he'd already, he was revamping it in some ways and turning it into its own thing.
But it feels like it feels authentic in the sense that there are lots of different versions of myths.
Right, exactly. Yes. That's how it feels. It's almost like the Elder Edda and the Prose Edda, or here's the really, like, here's Homer versus the what's the Ovid's Metamorphoses, kind of that. It's almost that take on it. So you can almost see it as the second volume of that. I should point out, almost everyone who talks about Dunsany's writings at that point, like what inspired him to write this. Pretty much everyone mentions that he was reading Nietzsche at that point. And if you know Nietzsche's impact on people like Richard Wagner, do you know the Ring Cycle at all, the operas there?
I mean, a little bit. I haven't actually watched it.
The fundamental themes of how Wagner interprets, which of course they were ancient Norse legends or Germanic legends, and of course he tweaks them to fit his mindset. But he's very big on the idea, like the fundamental thing is that man is going to rise up and be almost not quite at war with the gods, but conflict with them. And I mean, of course, they're headed for Ragnarok or Götterdämmerung or whatever you want to call it. The gods see their end coming, and they see that by creating man, they've created their end, but that also might be the thing that saves them. And that was all coming out of Wagner and Nietzsche. Literally, they were friends. They knew all this stuff, and it's very different tonally and style-wise, but those themes are lurking at the back of what Lord Dunsany does as well. This whole sort of don't see the gods as like just fair people who you should pray to. He literally says you don't pray to Mana Yutsushai.
Oh yeah. There's a running thing. The temple of all the gods save one.
Right.
Because if you try to pray to Mana Yutsushai, he'll wake up and kill you.
Right. Exactly.
And then go back to bed.
Which again is very Lovecraftian right there. It's not that he will go back to bed. It's every time somebody prays to him, he gets a little closer to waking up. Basically.
That as well. Yeah.
So don't pray. So Imbaun, who's the prophet, is known as the prophet of all the gods save one, and it's the temple of all the gods save one. You do not pray to Mana Yutsushai because he's out of your league, basically.
Yeah. He's the god that the gods worship.
Right. And there's another god named. He's actually described as the thing that is neither god nor beast.
Yeah.
Trogul.
Oh, Trogul.
Neither god nor beast. No one prays to Trogul. You do not pray to Trogul. Well, it's not that you don't pray to him. It's that he doesn't answer prayers. And he represents. He sits at literally the edge of the cosmos. With a giant book, and he fills it up with writing, and it starts white. When he turns the page, that's a new day. It's white because the light has shone. He fills it up with writing about everything that's happening in that day, and by the end of the day, the page is black. So the sun is set and it's gone dark, and he turns the next page. He never, ever flips backwards, and literally, I think it's Imbaun. Somebody goes to see Trogul and like in a dream, and he says, "Can you go back?" And I remember something really interesting happened. It was like, I do not turn back the pages of the book. They never happen. And you can pray to me all you want. I'm not going to change it. This is what happens. The pages turn. You can never turn it. And of course, that's the relentlessness of time and the fact that you can never go back and, take anything back or go back to, happier days.
And then there's another version of the telling, or once again, this is different versions of the same myth. The idea of that day and night comes from a little girl god playing with a golden ball that's the sun, and she keeps losing it, and then it's night, and then all the gods search for it and find it again, and it just keeps happening over and over and over again.
Yeah, and that is, as you say, that's very much authentic to how a lot of myths work.
Yeah. They're not internally consistent, but they have, because different myths have different purposes.
Right. And
so like Zeus in one story might be the antagonist, and in another story be beneficial to humanity. It depends on what that story's, what that needs to have, a powerful person represent.
Right. But you can argue that by the time, like when the ancient Greeks they were really sophisticated eventually, and, much longer, they were looking back at Homer and all the mythos, and by the time they might have tried to make something that papered over the inconsistencies, they were smart enough to know that, it was kind of it wasn't a literal description of the world, it was a philosophical thing to consider. And there's some of that, you get that in Pegāna too. It's the writings of it in the story of a culture that is very introspective and that's considering all this philosophical stuff as it happens. As I say, there's another thing. There's the story of the one guy, because the gods are very cruel in this. I can't remember why the gods go. I didn't reread Time and the Gods before this, but there's the one guy who gets everything taken from him by the gods. He loses his sight and his sound and all his memories, and the gods take everything away from him because.
I can't remember why either.
Yeah, he knew it was it, and again that is similar to Greek myth where I think it was Tiresias. Who was blinded because he knew too much, but the gods blinded him because he could see the future.
Not quite.
Yeah, it's not Tiresias?
It is Tiresias. He was blinded by the gods, but it's not because he knew too much.
Okay.
But it's a long story, so it involves gender switching and snakes having sex. It's a weird story.
No, that's a separate thing with Tiresias, if I'm not mistaken.
No, but it has to do with that. There was an argument between between Hera and Zeus about which sex enjoys sex more.
Right, yes.
And Tiresias, who had been both male and female, said women enjoy it more.
Yeah.
And so Zeus won, and Hera was mad, so she blinded him.
Right,
and Zeus gave him the gift of foresight as compensation.
Right. Okay, no, so it wasn't Tiresias, it was the king who was hounded by harpies. He was blinded, and they came and they always ate all his food and ruined all his food.
I'm not familiar with that one, but
Jason
that sounds like
Jason and the Argonauts. They meet him and they kill the harpies for him, and he's very grateful. But that's the thing; he was gifted with prophecy, and the reason, and Cassandra as well in the Trojan War. As a general rule, you get people who knew too much and were too wise, and the gods would find some way of, messing them over about that.
Yeah, one of the stories of I keep forgetting his name, Imbaum, involves him telling a king that he'll die someday, and then Imbaum gets taken away to be killed. So
that's right.
There's multiple versions of his death too. So
and that's the last Imbaum story, if I'm not mistaken.
I think so.
And it's very casual, like mentioned that he's just dragged off to be killed. He's been a major character in the story, and then it's basically he comes forward and the king asks, "Will I die, Imbaum?" And Imbaum says, "Your Majesty, yes, you will die. All things will die." And he goes, "Well, I know you're gonna die." And he drags him, and they said, and the guards took him away. And then the last sentences, and then there arose prophets who spoke not of death to the king.
Yeah,
and that's literally, I think, the last we hear of Imbaum in that entire book, which is very fun. The other interesting thing about Imbaum, he's the one note. Dunsany apparently was not very religious. And this is of course a very pagan mythos. He's the one note that maybe injects a note of Christianity into it.
I didn't pick that up. So
there's one moment, well, like I say, he sees forward into the future, into a better world at one point, and he literally describes things like the Boer War, like the fact that they had he describes seeing forward all the way into the future, including wars that were fought with poison gases and things like that. So it's clearly him mentioning, his own time frame. Yeah. And again, this is before World War I, so he would have been talking about the Boer War, but it actually reads like a prelude of World War I. But the big one to me is where Imbaum starts saying, well, you know what? It's all going to be okay, basically. And the god and the people come to him and they say, well, but what about our enemies? Are they going to be, thrust into a lake of fire and burnt? Like very obviously, an unforgiving Old Testament mindset. And Imbaum goes, no, that's not going to happen. And the writing on the mountain says, thine enemies are forgiven. That's the sentence that sort of that's the end of Imbaum's statement. And that's kind of the big note of hope in this, after all the gods being jerks about everything.
Okay, yeah.
That's the
I didn't really pick up on that as a Christianity thing, but it reads that way.
It's Christian in the sense that it's forgiveness and it's hope.
I'm just saying I didn't initially pick up on that. So that does come across that way now that I think about it. It
is the one note of, maybe we're not all boned, basically, in this mythology. You're like, oh, okay, so that's why, all the Pegānans of ancient days didn't just all commit suicide because their religion is so horrible.
the last section in Time of the Gods is a lengthy bit where a king wants to find out about the afterlife, and all his prophets give him different versions. Right. And that feels like a summation of the whole thing in some ways.
Yes. It's kind of like if you're familiar with the Mahabharata, which is the Indian, the national epic poem of India. It's kind of one of their fundamental. It's their version of the Iliad and the Odyssey, if you like. And there's a part of it which is considered to have been written later and inserted into it, which is called the Bhagavad Gita.
Oh yeah, okay.
And it's basically the conversation that Arjuna the king has with his charioteer. Who is, if I'm not mistaken, Krishna in disguise. And they have a whole conversation about, life and because he's literally about to declare a huge civil war that's going to tear his family apart and they're all going to murder each other. And he's basically saying, is this right? Should we be doing this? And they have a gigantic, conversation about philosophy, life, the universe, and everything, which I believe is meant to specifically have taken like time slowed down, and it took 1,000 years for them to have this giant conversation. And so that's another thing that in some ways is echoed in that story at the end of Time and the Gods. It's that kind of like, okay, this is the real philosophical meat of everything we've been leading up to so far. So you get that same sense that, somebody took the basic mythology and wrote a giant philosophical exploration and added it to the story, basically. But yeah, it's very interestingly done in that way. From
my understanding, Dunsany did eventually travel throughout the Middle East and Africa and whatnot, and apparently that turned him off from this style, so he moved away to other topics later on.
Oh, interesting.
So he just sort of, I guess the mystery had left, or the sense of exoticness had left after he actually experienced it.
Well, that's interesting. Beyond the story, the idle days on the Yan, and
that's still from fairly early.
Is it? Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
His later stories I haven't really gotten into because his absolute last series is the Yorkin series, which is about a guy telling tall tales. So it's sort of it's more silly than anything.
Yeah, I've heard about that. Yeah, it's kind of.
I've read one of them where he goes to Mars on an airplane and on the way back comes across a comet where there's tiny little elephants on it. It's a weird story.
Well, he's always weird, Dunsany.
Yeah, but it's weird in a way that doesn't feel. That was actually the first Dunsany story I read, and it doesn't feel like anything else that I've read from him. So I like his early and mid-career stuff a lot better.
Yeah, I mean, he wrote one novel that I haven't read, which is apparently a bit of a nod to Don Quixote, but a bit more fantastical. It's set in it's set in Spain. It's got a Spanish knight. Then he wrote The King of Elfland's Daughter, which is his best-known novel, I believe.
Which I haven't read.
I have. It's very good. That is a very huge influence on Neil Gaiman. When you read it, you're like, Neil Gaiman definitely knew this.
Neil Gaiman. There's a story in one of the mid-career Lord Dunsany collections where about gods in the modern day. It was Odin and Thor traveling to Stonehenge, and I read that and this is where Neil Gaiman got American Gods from.
Yeah.
There's no other explanation. Neil Gaiman was known to read Lord Dunsany, so
he's never made a secret of it that he loved Lord Dunsany. King of Elfland's Daughter feels a lot like Stardust in many ways. It's about humans crossing the. I mean, it's a different story, but it's humans crossing the veil into quote Elfland, i.e., the lands of fairy, and it's got that same style. But yeah, he tended to write European style fantasies after
later
a certain
on.
point. Yeah, it stopped being that sort of exotic thing.
Yeah. I mean, he was influential in some ways. One story he wrote later on was called the House of the Gnolls, and he created the word gnoll. And Dungeons & Dragons picked it up. They spelled it slightly differently, but so that's where gnolls come from.
Right, yes. And they're like little I'm a guy who doesn't play Dungeons & Dragons.
In Dunsany, they're not described. In Dungeons & Dragons, they're hyena people.
Right, yeah. That's what's the story called?
The House of the Gnolls.
Okay. GNOLES, right?
Yeah. And the Dungeons & Dragons is spelled with 2 L's and an S.
Right.
No E. Yeah.
As we've seen, Dungeons & Dragons borrows from a lot of sometimes obscure, sometimes less obscure fantasy things. That was definitely an influence. Anyway, I think we're hitting the end of the story here. So let's the pages of Trogul's book have grown black with writing, signifying that the day has turned to night, and Sish slays the hours as they come. So it's time once more to say goodbye. This show was produced by Alex Ross, the mirthless god who knows the secrets of Mana Yud Sushai, and the theme song was by Jack Furyk, who beateth his drum to soothe Mana Yud Sushai to sleep. We're Adam Prosser, the prophet who speaks not of death to kings, and Phil Rice, who was but a shepherd and could not know. We'll be sailing down the river of silence on our golden galleons, but we'll see you again in 2 weeks. Until then, trouble not Mana Yud Sushai with your prayers.